Excellent, and welcome to a session on, well, it's going to cover many things, but the core for me is Truth in Telecoms, the history of KYC, with one of the key figures right at the start of the industry, Jason Welch. Jason, I'm so happy to have you here.
Thanks, Alan. Thank
And
you,
then
Mr. Tyrone.
I will hand over to Johnny because Johnny's going to preface this with a big blodge of history.
Well, look, I needed to find the smartest guy that I knew in voice, right? And I got to go back to late 90s, early 2000s. And, all you guys out there that think you understand voice or KYC or any of that stuff, Jason pretty much forgot what you guys know. So Jason's background, and I'll just point to the point of time when I got to know him. So Jason worked for a gentleman named Sam Tawfik, and he had a brother named Kenny Tawfik. They started something called PT1, which was the original biggest phone card company. So picture PT1 as the Twilio of the calling card industry. Then they sold that. So he basically invented the calling card industry. Sam Tawfik is genius, genius guy. And sold that company to a public company back in the early 2000s. Everything was .coms, public companies. He sold it. Then he came back in and started a company, which is a really important one, called STI, the Telco Group, and which I'll get to later, Alan. It's actually how I got involved in messaging by cleaning up a $500 million bankruptcy after Sam and Jason sold out of STI. A private equity group bought it, and then a Mexican company bought it, and they had no idea what they were doing, and it was just a big mess, bust out. It was like very complicated business to run. So, yeah. So Jason ran the networks, and he can get to his background prior to that, which is pretty extensive, and afterwards as well. He's done a lot of great things, but there was a period of time there for like 5 years where Jason was, the most powerful guy in voice. He decided, so much that happened at a critical time in telecom, with the amount of value you can give customers, reciprocal compensation deals on DIDs that changed the game. Now you have IDT that has kept going. But before IDT, you had PT1, which IDT ironically ended up taking over. And IDT is still a multi-billion-dollar company. But even if you ask Howard Jonas, he'll tell you the smartest guy out there was Sam Tawfik. He was one guy, and he had a brother. His brother, Kenny Tawfik, my best friend, passed away a year ago. I'm still choked up over it. And these two guys were the most eccentric, complete opposite individuals on the planet Earth, and just special people. I think Sam just had a public company. He bought up all kinds of car dealerships and did something else, and really brilliant. But Kenny passed away, and who taught me a lot of lessons in life. Also, probably the only guy I was ever kind of afraid of, a little bit, because fear is not something I remember. But I was more from a standpoint of he was just a class act, and Sunday dinners. And he's an Arab guy that married an Italian girl, and you could swear he was Italian. I mean, he cooked Italian. You go into his house, he had lions on the wall. He had an arsenal, and just a house full of people and good times and fun. And but what Jason pulled off there, they had a successful exit with Lucadia, is pretty amazing. So I wanted to just give that prelude to Jason, because he can get into what he's done at 46 Labs and other stuff at Impact, which is now Limgo, which Impact, believe it or not, was my first partner at Irish Wireless. And then I got involved with Tintec and made a deal there, which is another story. But I think one other big news, and Alan, you should have started with this, the Newsmax story that Telnex did with Newsmax on their FCC filing disappeared this morning off the web. Why? I don't know. Could it have been my post? Could it have been them having a little Italian dinner somewhere and trying to iron this out? I sure hope so, because if the FCC wanted to, they could destroy a company like Telenex or anybody they want to. You can't. Going up against the government, it's a scary thing. So I just wanted to give that prelude. This is special for me, and having Jason Welch here is just priceless.
Exactly, because I think this discussion with Jason is going to provide some context in understanding the history of Know Your Customer, because that's been pointed at basically the Telnex story. But I think what Jason's going to share with us will help us better understand what really is going on in that story. So, Jason.
Well, thank you. I first of all, I appreciate the introduction and some of the history, Johnny. You know, um, I'm not big on tooting certainly my horn, but I will say that in the context of STI and Telco Group, the 4 or so years that I actually worked there, and I was involved with them for a couple of years prior to that, which I'll get into supporting them as an account manager. They were a customer of ours at the time at Frontier/Global Crossing. I would say I learned more in my career in that 4 years than at any other time, hands down. And it really just had to do with, first of all, the ingenuity of the folks that were there. You're right, Sam, from a network perspective, from a distribution perspective, Kenny certainly, in his expertise in distribution. And there's so many folks in that organization that were just top notch folks,
Rock stars,
from top to bottom, right? And
they also had to deal with Sam,
they're
but
all
also
spread
dealing with Sam was not easy. One of the most difficult human beings within an office building. Outside of it, a lot of fun.
It's funny. I've heard folks talk about his demanding nature. At the end of the day, and this just kind of holds true in business in general. It was a privately held entity. So anything that Sam was doing, or anything that you were doing on behalf of the company, was as though he was writing a check out of his personal checkbook. So you need to understand that, right? It's like, look, if I was writing this check out of my own personal checkbook, am I still going to make the same decision? And, generally speaking, you had to understand yourself as what you were, and that was a tool in the shed. Okay. And if that tool is adding value and is remaining relevant, then that tool is going to continue to be used. At the point that tool is no longer adding value and has no more relevancy, it doesn't really matter what the tool did in the past. That tool needed to be removed from the tool shed. So if you understood that, then you were in good shape. Okay,
he was the original Doge,
and you continue to make yourself a valuable tool, and you continue to reinvent, right? But one of the reasons why I learned so much during that experience is because there were things that were thrown at me that I had no business or experience doing. And I would look and say, why are you asking me to do this? Well, figure it out. Okay. And you went and you figured it out, right? There's so much learning in that period. But let me give a little context before that, and then how I got into that, because it kind of plays into, what the topic of this discussion is about, which is, know your customer. So history provides guidance for present and future. All right. And you can sit there in your car and always look in the rearview mirror and your side mirrors, and you'll end up in a ditch. Yeah. But you do need to look at history for context, right? Because so much of what this podcast is about is new innovation. Yeah. Why are these new innovations occurring, right? Well, there's a solid grasp on, for many of these innovators, on history. And so, from a history perspective, I cut my teeth for Rochester Telephone back in the mid to late 90s. And, during that time, Rochester Telephone did something with the New York Public Service Commission called the Open Market Plan. And they rolled that out in 1995. It was the predecessor to the Telecom Act of 1996. And, as a result of that, a lot of people say, why is, Rochester, New York such a mecca for telecom? This is the reason, right? Everybody came in to try their hand at competition. Cellular One was, doing local resale. Time Warner, cable. You had Paytech, you had Choice One, you had Empower, the list goes on and on and on. But what they were doing is they were coming in and they were trying their hand at local competition in the Rochester market. Okay. And kind of getting ready for, the broader launch across the U.S. under, the Telecom Act of 1996. So in that time period, I was an account manager supporting CLECs and wireless carriers and, competition coming in to do competition.
Yeah.
It was during this time that, reciprocal compensation was being rolled out. And, there were a lot of things in the early onslaught of recip comp and intercarrier compensation that were new and, becoming recognized. As an example, I guarantee you Rochester Telephone had no thought about Time Warner going and grabbing this small little customer called AOL and people being up on dial-up internet, right? Where recip comp is just ringing up, ringing up, ringing up. So now that turns into, okay, we need to have ratios and so on and so forth.
Gotcha.
So, in this time of competition, there was a lot of things around intercarrier compensation that was driving innovative ways of traffic exchange. Okay. Carriers were trying to game each other, right? Because you wanted to receive larger checks than you were paying out. And so, when you start talking about that and you want to wonder why, right? This is when I get into history, why robocalling became such a big thing. Well, you could start, and going back and saying robocalling actually had some of its roots in how carriers were trying to compete against each other as it pertained to intercarrier compensation. All right. So history, right? History is important to understand kind of how we've gotten to where we are. And, the other thing that I'll say in the context of history is, regulation is the mother of innovation. You can see that in so many different ways. You certainly see it in the communication sector, okay, but you can see it in so many other sectors. When it comes to, robocalling and texting, we've got WhatsApp. When it comes to taxi cabs and medallions, you've got Uber. When it comes to cable television regulations, you've got Netflix. And you can go and see, that regulations historically start to produce innovation. And we see that today, right? We're going to continue to see that, which makes things exciting to watch. So if you have some understanding, I believe, of history and you have some understanding of regulation, then you kind of have a little bit of bead on where innovation might be going, right? Or what could be innovative, in the future. In all of that history, I was dealing with, moved on to dealing with the actual interconnection group. So we were negotiating all the interconnection agreements, both as a CLEC, because now Frontier owned CLECs, as well as a LEC, because they had the incumbent properties.
Yeah.
And then I had some experience there on the long distance side of Frontier, which this is when Frontier and Global Crossing came together. And along came this customer, this new customer of Global Crossings called Telco Group STI Prepaid. Never heard of these people. Everybody's saying, oh, they PT1 and the biggest international, prepaid calling card, service provider in the nation, and so on and so forth. And I said, okay, sounds good. Okay. And they want to start and they need an OC48. Now, back in the very late 90s, 2000-ish, an OC48, I mean,
big.
Who the heck needs an OC48? and I'm like, okay, so let me, I'm sitting there with my fingers. Okay, there's 2018 ones and a DS3 on each T1. There's 24, and an OC48 is 48 DS3. And I'm doing the math in my mind, and I'm like, how are they going to possibly have this amount of concurrent calls going on and produce this kind of traffic? And so, their timelines were aggressive, right? And an OC48, spinning one of those up back in that day and age was a unique experience because people weren't ordering those, right? And then of course we have to multiplex those down to OC12s and OC3s, and then get them channelized into, right? So, I was kind of behind the scenes assisting them, implementing them as a customer on Global Crossings network. And, so we start bringing them up, and next thing I know, these channels are filling up like this. And I'm like, I can't believe what I'm seeing. Right. And here comes the next order for the next OCX system, right? Here comes the next order for the next. So, I finally got the initial implementation complete. with a wonderful group of people. I spent a lot of time on the phone during those days with a young lady, Helene Kaderi. She's
He's
an
awesome.
absolute legend in this
Legend.
business.
Still around.
Hands down. She's fantastic lady. Taught me a whole boatload of stuff. Okay, and so I had implemented the account, handed it off to an account manager, moved on to implement other accounts, ultimately moved on to a different role within Frontier. And a couple years down the road, Helene called me and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm doing X, Y, and Z." Well, come speak with Sam and myself. We want to talk to you. We're busting at the seams, and we could use some help. So I ended up, joining them in 2003, and moving on in 2007. And it was an absolute, the craziest train ride of my career, I would say. 4 years. The most learning I've ever had, probably in such a compacted period of time. And overall, from an exit perspective, just a great exit and a great experience, right? One that I value and refer to back to pretty often. So thanks for bringing that up, Johnny, and
they're the OGs. I mean, people don't understand. We were the SMS industry that is today. I compare it very much. That's why I got involved in this industry after I cleaned up the SCI bankruptcy. That's how I got involved with Irish Wireless and why I'm sitting here with Alan Quayle. But back to KYC and the history.
Sure.
And because I called you because I obviously, what is KYC? I mean, right now we have a company that even the campaign registry I hear is doing their own KYC for sole proprietorships. Like, how does that work? Like, you're going to trust these guys? So this whole KYC thing that came up with David Kassem, who's also a friend of ours here at TAT Summit, Truth and Telecoms, and you can hear in my posts, I'm a big fan of his fighting. But what really is it? Is there such a thing as KYC? I mean,
well, let's settle that. Let's settle that right now. Yeah. There is no such thing as KYC. There it is. Okay. There is no such thing, right? Because it is very subjective.
Yeah.
Right? It's subjective based on the whims of the regulators and the service providers. And there's not a proper framework for it. So, when you start getting into KYC, you're getting into the feds abdicating their responsibility of clear legislation, right?
Yeah.
Proper regulatory framework, and clear enforcement, right, with due process within that. And what's happening is they're taking some of that in a very unclear, undefined way, and they're delegating that responsibility to private enterprise, right? And they're delegating that without a solid framework. So, therein kind of, comes the issue in and of itself. And, I think that service providers, by and large, I think service providers want to do the right thing. They want to protect their customers from, improper robocalling. They want to protect their customers from scammers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, they also have financial benefit for filling up those networks, right? I mean, that is, kind of what they're there for. They're there to fill up them, the networks with communication and, monetize that, for the benefit of their investors. Yeah. So, I think that it's very important that if we're going to go ahead and put, this responsibility into the hand of private enterprise, then it needs to be done in a way that provides a very solid framework, right? Not loose framework, but a solid framework. There's got to be clear bar, right? Yeah. A clear bar within that framework. And then for those people who are actually operating within that appropriately, there's got to be some safe harbor there too.
Yeah.
Okay. You see kind of with KYC, an imbalance between industries on how some of this stuff is handled, right? So, not for nothing, but internet traffic, video traffic, SMS traffic, voice traffic, by and large, in today's day and age, are running over the same modes of transportation, right? Fiber, wireless, satellite, whatever. They're on the same pipes. On the voice traffic side of things, you have all of these regulatory obligations, stir shaken, robocall mitigation, KYC, all that stuff. But yet for communications running over the same exact pipe with Meta, Google, etc., they have, Section 230 immunity. And, there isn't really any strong KYC involved there. And so, at the end of the day, communication service providers are transporting information, okay? And that information can be, or communication, that can be encapsulated in any number of different forms, which, we talked about voice and data and whatnot. Okay. But, what's the real intent? Okay. And this is something that we're not going to be able to get to as communication service providers, but, do they really want us to know the customer? Okay. Do they want to stop scams and criminal activity from occurring or unwanted communications from occurring? The only real way that you're able to truly do that is to actually monitor the communication themselves. Yeah. Right. And now you're getting into censorship and, things of that nature. Right. So, service providers aren't in a position to say, okay, well, not only do we have to know who's making the call and what's going on here, but we have to understand what the communication is itself. Right. You could take the lingo situation. Okay. The lingo situation, and this leads a little bit more into, some of the breakdown with KYC, which I'm gonna touch on, right, and how it's trying to be addressed. But you take the lingo situation, where they had a customer that I believe has been a customer of theirs for a pretty lengthy period of time. They've known this customer for a pretty lengthy period of time. And, this customer had a customer on their network. Okay. And they spoofed a number resource. Okay. Which then, was attested and, passed through. And I would imagine that occurs quite often in communications networks. Yeah. Okay. Not I imagine. I'm pretty sure it does. Right. Number spoofing is a problem. Right? Yep. And we'll talk about why that's a problem too. But, at the end of the day, had those calls been made and it was, a legitimate communication for whatever, something like this wouldn't be flagged. Why was it flagged? It was flagged because it was a deep fake of voice, for whatever. So, it got flagged. So, do we then need to monitor the content of the communication as well, right? Which becomes a slippery slope. Yeah. So, let me talk about kind of, some of the legs around KYC, right? And so, what's really important is the chain of custody of the call. Yeah. Okay. That's what all this is about. It's about chain of custody, of the call. Who originated the call? Where did that call touch? Where does that call eventually, terminate to? And, was it legitimate? Was it allowable, or was it not? So we've got, stir shaken that's been put into place. With stir shaken being put into place, you have the robocall mitigation database. You have the traceback group, industry traceback group, right? And then you have, know your customer. All of these are pieces, in my view, to the puzzle, but they don't holistically solve the problem. All right. stir shaking in and of itself is, in my view, a partial solution. It's partial in that there's still a lot of TDM network in the ground out there. And as soon as that call touches that TDM network, that stir shaken attestation is stripped from the call. So that becomes a problem. So I think that, we need to enforce IP interconnection across the board so that stir shaken is something that's, fully implemented. All service providers, in my view, if you're able, and there's a problem if you're an IPES provider to get the proper credentials, to be able to implement stir shaking, right? So all service providers, if they're designated as a service provider, at least in, the North American number dialing plan, they need to be able to get stir shaking credentials, and they should also be able to get numbering resources. And here's one of the problems that get injected into this whole ecosystem. And that is, there is a significant practice of wholesaling numbering resources, right? Now, I'm not going to get into how numbering resources are finite. That's a whole different discussion. But what I will say is that this practice of wholesaling numbers to different providers injects a whole different level of complexity into the chain of custody. Okay. Spoofing is its own thing, but when you have one service provider selling numbers to another service provider who then is using those numbers for a customer because they didn't have numbering resources in the footprint that the customer wanted, it brings its whole level of complexity. And this is what ends up happening, right? You end up having a customer with SIP trunking. Okay, you get somebody else's numbers, this customer, and so you say this customer is good, and you attest that customer to being a known customer to you as an A-level attestation. The problem is where KYC starts to break down is you don't know what's behind that customer, right? Exactly. And what's going on behind that customer and what they're doing, and so things start to break down a little bit, but. A lot of the breakdowns that are occurring kind of within this ecosystem today is, this issue of stolen identity. Because at the end of the day, when someone's spoofing a number or using a number inappropriately, or they're a scammer, what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to promote a false identity, or they're stealing someone else's identity. Okay. And there's only so much that our current stir shaken robocall mitigation, trace back and all that does when it comes to false identity and identity misuse.
Yeah.
All right. So, this then gets into trying to implement a more holistic solution, which involves identity management.
Yeah.
Okay. When you start talking about know your customer, what you're talking about really is know the identity of who you're dealing with. Okay. Now, we can do this between enterprises. That's what we do today. I know my customer. My customer is this bank. I know my customer. My customer is this carrier. I know my customer. Okay, you can do that. But at the end of the day, who really is the end customer? It's like us with consumers on the phone.
Yeah.
And this is where things start to break down, right? All the enterprises know each other pretty well. They can tokenize each other back and forth, okay, to some extent. And they can try to ascertain, and make sure that each party has, legitimate business. But that starts to break down when it gets to the actual consumers of the service at the very end, which are retail consumers, right? The average Joe. So this is where, when I talk about history and regulation and innovation, you can start to see, because I know that this particular podcast isn't necessarily about telecom history and communications history, but it's about innovation, right? So I just spit out a whole bunch about history and kind of a little bit about where we are today. But then the question becomes, what's the opportunity from where we go to where we go tomorrow? And you guys have had some very interesting guests on some previous podcasts, some innovators that are out there, I think solving for, some of this, this identity issue,
Yeah.
right? Which becomes, very exciting. And I think could really start to lock down, true identity. The issue with the whole know your customer and well, let me step back for a minute. I get a whole bunch of junk mail in my mailbox I don't want. Okay. I get a ton of email in my email box I don't want. I get a bunch of robocalls on my mobile phone. Don't want them. Okay. You can sit there on social media or you can sit there surfing the web and you're going to get a bunch of ads you don't want. Right. So we have a whole bunch of industry trying to either use or define our identity. And, if you have kids, you always say to them, don't let someone else define you.
Yeah.
Don't let be secure in your identity. Understand who you are as an individual and operate in that way. Right? Okay. So we do that, and we do that on a personal level. But when it comes to our communications and, how we're communicated with and who we communicate to, we abdicate our responsibility and just hand it over to somebody. You see it, right? It happens to you every day. I'm standing at the checkout at my local grocery store. I open the app, so scan it to get my discounts, and a thing pops up and says, "You haven't agreed to these new updated terms and conditions." I'm sitting. I got a line of people, behind me. Do you accept? Yes, I accept. I don't know what I just accepted to.
Yeah.
Who knows what I accepted to, right?
Yeah.
My grocery list is getting sent to I don't know where, right? You jump in the car, you're in a hurry. A navigation system pops up and it says, new terms and conditions and location tracking, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm in a hurry. I got to be to this place in 10 minutes. Yes. Moving on. Next thing you know, the insurance industry is getting your driving habits and you're wondering why they just dropped you. Okay. Yeah. So what we're doing is we're taking and we're handing off our identities to be managed by others. All right. And I know, what I'm trying to do here, and there's been an intention in the way I've kind of, framed this up. If we want to actually get to know your customer, we've got to go beyond the enterprise to enterprise know your customer. And we've actually got to involve the consumer on each end of the equation.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we've got to do. And, when you actually understand the identity on this end and the identity on this end agree to an exchange of information with each other, then you truly have end-to-end knowing your customer. Okay? Mm-hmm. And I think, one of the innovators you've had on this on the show previously is looking to actually try to solve, for this thing. Right? When you think about Stir Shaken, what are they doing? Okay, a carrier has this token and a carrier has this token, and their tokens go, oh, yeah, this is all legitimate. We can move forward with this. Wonderful. Oh, all right. Well, there's other kind of similar applications out there, right? NFT, non-fungible token. What's not to say that there's a, Jason Welch, NFT, me, my identity, and I'm the one who's actually saying, yes, you can use my information. Yes, I will communicate with this person. No, right? It's another exchange of tokens, but it's expanding the ecosystem of communications to the actual consumers themselves and giving them control over their identities and how they want to communicate. and with whom they want to communicate and exchange data with, and starting to put the power in their hands. Now, does that solve for still stolen identities and misuse of information? No, it doesn't, but it's certainly a much larger step in the right direction comparative to where we are today, which is a much smaller ecosystem determining the communications that are passed versus not passed, right?
Yeah.
I would much rather determine which communications I want versus not, versus having another party, being a service provider, determine for me what I should see versus what I shouldn't see, given their reasonable analytics and their systems and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
All right. I said an awful lot in a short period, so.
That's brilliant. Basically, there's no end in sight because the identity issue is never really going to be solved. And that goes into a different conversation that gets into politics, and you can't go there.
We won't go there.
You can brush that word out, Alan. But that's the reason why it'll never happen. So, I mean, all this KYC that people are talking about, I get messages from people. I wrote a post last night, and they're like, "Oh, did you see his KYC?" I'm like, "What KYC? What are you talking about? There is no KYC." I keep saying the same thing, but I can't elaborate it the way you do. But it just seems like the FCC and these agencies are just trying to figure out a way to play whack-a-mole with the situation, give fines out arbitrarily. Because if you're you might as well just fine, like I put out, why aren't you fining Twilio? I mean, especially on the SMS side, I mean, they enabled it. They created spam in this country. Full stop. Across the board. I mean, Cineverse just lost their P2P connection to T-Mobile. Why? Because it kept pumping all the A to P down to P2P. So where this whole thing with Mr. Telnex here, obviously, how do you read that? I mean, just your perspective.
Yeah, there are things within that whole situation that make me scratch my head. Okay. First of all, this isn't your typical, robocalling campaign that hits, X millions of users in X period of time, right? This was a very, very strategic and directed campaign, from what I could tell, with not a large number of calls, but not what you typically see, whatever, less than a couple thousand calls, right? Directed to, our regulators, phones and their families. Okay.
Exactly.
So, when I look at that, I'm like, okay, well, that's a real odd, campaign. All right. Certainly, there are things, related to, KYC. We can get into IP addresses that they signed up with and payments types that they used, and and physical addresses that were used, et cetera, et cetera. And, a lot of those things did not appear to be valid. And I think that, some additional background, work in the customer engagement process could have assisted there. I do give Telnex a lot of credit because it went on for, less than 24 hours. What was it, 17 hours or whatever? So it wasn't a campaign that, was extensive and went on for weeks or months or anything like that. And although that would probably be pretty difficult targeting, the FCC.
It was almost like they had the cop on the side of the road with the radar detector.
I think
after somebody called him and told him your wife is going into labor.
It reeks of a setup.
Yeah.
Setup. 100%.
Okay. It reeks of a setup to me. I can't, I don't know, or I'm not going to pontificate on who might be doing the setting up, but it does reek of a setup. And, I believe that the punishment does not fit the crime. I think that Telnex was, just the unlucky service provider be caught up in this setup, and that I think it's a $4.5 million fine that
But the punishment is worse than that. The punishment is its reputation. So
Well, it goes.
my conversation with him is reputational. The guy
Yeah,
spent a lot of years building his business, and
yeah,
for him, it's reputational. You could destroy somebody's business
yeah.
with this, right? Especially in voice. So
Well, and this is, Johnny, you bring up, you bring up something that, I've seen over the years. Okay. And, certainly, as administrations change, chairmans and, balance of power within, the regulatory entities adjust, right? And so you do see some um, whipsawing back and forth on certain items,
well,
right?
I mean,
What
right
you,
now
you
we're
know,
living in. It's like we're living in a civil war in
um,
this country
so
without guns, just
so
words.
so I yeah. So what I will say is that there is a long history of tradition here within within our country where regulators have a unique ability to pick winners and losers. Okay. And so they're picking winners and losers based on whatever criteria they have at the time. But, you can go and you could talk about, and, Telnex, and they're a good group of people. Okay. In a former life of mine, they were a customer on our network. Right. So this is a good group of folks that have a very compelling, business proposition, and they're a solid enterprise. Okay. But you'll get, some of these players that, get caught in X, Y, or Z, and they'll get hit. And, when it comes to a smaller communications provider, right? Especially when something like this comes up, all of a sudden, all of their interconnecting service providers are calling them right away, right? This happens every
Yep.
time. What's going on? You've got this locked down. I don't want to have to, stop processing your traffic, and boom, 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 boom. So you go right into, reputation protection, right? I've got to go ahead and defend myself. I've got to defend my reputation, and so on and so forth. And it is, at best difficult to run a entrepreneurial enterprise in our country, right? The stats are there that says that. It's even more difficult when you are fighting a deterioration of your reputation based on allegations, okay, and getting hammered with large potential fines, right?
Mhm.
My question in this is, there are certain things that perhaps were not done as good as they could have been from a vetting process of the customer. But what about the actual perpetrators of the criminal activity in the first place?
Yeah,
Definitely
Okay.
criminal activity.
Where what's going on with them? How are they being found out? How are they being held accountable? Right. That's where the sledgehammer should be. It shouldn't be on Telnex, in my view. Okay. Not to the, again, I don't believe that the punishment, fits the crime.
Well,
But what
I heard, I'll give you what I heard. I heard from a really good source that they lost the one-to-one consent hearing recently, and they needed like a win. I guess this is what and this is just coming from the industry. Again, we had the czar on here. We've had obviously Noah Rafalco trying to solve the problem. We've had UMail on here. We've had so many different perspectives. A lot of the stuff that Alan and I focused on was messaging, and now we're heading into this because one of our own, David Kasem from Telnex. Look, the guy's quirky, smart as hell, but anybody who fights like this, you set up clear, set up. It's not even a question. He was put in the way he's fighting. They could either destroy his business or some kind of deal. I'm hoping that they dropped that Newsmax story today. This morning, gone. I put that. It came out last night. Bang! I put it up. My post. Not that many people liked it because for whatever reason, but the story's gone today. So what's going on? I'm hoping they figured it out and realized, look, kid, you got set up, because he had to have spent 7 figures already just on lawyers and a PR firm. I think he hired Mr. Musk's PR firm because the guy cares about his business. guy cares about his reputation in business. I've had many interactions with him where he'll come after me if I say something wrong or controversial. So, where are we going with this? Obviously, coming on here and you talking about that, they're really. And what is this call labeling? What is this all about? What is this call labeling? Can you help me with this one? Is this a solution? Branded calling. What is this?
Yeah, Brandon. Well, I think again it gets into narrowing in further on identity, right? But until you get to a point where I think the actual consumer is involved in that identity label, right, and really giving their permission to use their identity, so on. So until you get to that point, what do I mean by this? Because I'm rambling. Well,
it's for the brands.
I'm rambling a little bit. In order for me,
but the brands want you to pick up the phone, right? So,
in order for me
it's me, Nike.
Yeah, in order for me to drive my car, I have to have a driver's license, right? And I go through all sorts of things to get that piece of identity. In order for me to travel internationally, I have to have a passport. So this is me and this is my identity.
Yeah.
Okay. We have various means of saying, I am who I say I am, and given my identity, this is what I am able to do or not do, or what I want done or do not want done.
Yeah.
Okay. We need to get to that level of interaction and that level of, right, this is going to involve something that is a centralized, be all end all identity information center that is able to be distributed. We do this, whether it's social security numbers or driver's license. Okay, we have these concepts out there, but we haven't applied these concepts in the communication space, okay, all the way down to the consumer level with the consumer's involvement, right? And you know what? There are some very nifty things. Again, going back to previous podcasts, there are some very nifty things. A blockchain is a perfect, platform for, a centralized but distributed identity management.
But at the end of the day, I think you said it before. They're pipes. Traffic has to flow. They make money on the traffic. It's and these are all for-profit, mostly publicly owned companies. Who is going to actually mandate this? I read this article the other day. 1 out of 3 Americans have been defrauded. 1 out of 3. That's staggering. I mean, look what's going on now just with fentanyl, tariff wars because of stopping fentanyl, which is far worse than anything I've ever seen. But my point is, nothing's really going to happen here. It's just going to be the same old, same old.
I don't think we throw up our hands and we give up.
It's not us. It's the regulator. The regulators are going after news channels. They're going after radio stations.
I was going to say, but what I do believe is that you can't put the policing of people's communications, okay, to the service providers that are actually providing the communication services, right? All right, that's. Not that you are putting the fox in the hen house, but that's not what I'm saying. But that's not the right place for for policing, right? Yeah. No more than I would say the social media platforms are the right place for censorship, right? That you've this is where we start getting into a whole different topic of discussion. But what I will say is, from the regulators, if we want to solve this, right, it goes back to one of my, earlier statements. There has to be clear legislation.
Yeah.
Okay. There's got to be stood up around that clear legislation, a proper framework of regulation that's providing clear bars, right, that need to be attained, and there needs to be, enforcement from our civil government for bad actors, right?
Yeah.
But to just go ahead and abdicate that responsibility to pick the enterprise,
Well, right now, like you have, I mean, you have Aegis. I think Aegis is the only company that does vetting for SMS. The only one.
Well, the reason why SMS became the way SMS was is everything started getting locked down on the voice networks with robocall mitigation, and so everybody goes, "Oh, SMS, that's not regulated yet. Let's jump over there."
Yeah.
And it's never.
And all the players just jumped over. Again, regulation produces innovation. That's not just for innovative new businesses. That's the scammers are some of the most innovative types that there are on the planet. If they actually use that innovation for good. We have a whole bunch of Einsteins that are out there.
They're using it for good. They're using it for their own good.
They're using it for their own good. Yes, not for the general good of others. But
they're making money.
What ends up happening is when because you said something, and so I want to touch on that real quick. Okay, what ends up happening is that when you put this policing mechanism into the hands of service providers, you're also now having the regulators become partial, right? Because they're going to say, and this is why this is why it seems like, okay, they did this to this service provider over here, but they did that to that service provider over there. This one they're going to put out of business. This one they barely touched. Why? Because now the regulators are picking and choosing, since they've given enforcement and policing and enforcement activities to service providers. Now what they're doing is they're saying, well, this company does it the way we like it, and this company doesn't seem to do it as much as we like, right? So who are the companies that have been awarded some of the largest fines, okay, from the FCC? They're the ones that are our biggest incumbent communication providers in the U.S. All right, but there is some, in my view, preferential treatment that they get because the FCC goes, we like the way they're dealing with it. But then this, new startup who's, entrepreneurial nature and so on and so forth, we didn't really give them a great, framework, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to hit them over the head with a sledgehammer and come close to putting them out of the business or destroying their reputation because we want to weed them out. Okay. Well, you're kind of, because of the way that this has been pushed into the service provider space, this, policing and enforcement, you're now allowing the regulators to, with an uneven hand, right? Because it's not clear. They're not giving clear information. So now they can, with an uneven hand, say, okay, wireless big three, we're going to hit you with a $200 million fine because you did X, Y, and Z, which is like a slap on the wrist to them. Okay, then they settle behind the scenes on that, NAL for whatever pennies on the dollar, and boom, that's it. But then they'll take this other, provider and say, well, you didn't meet our level of our bar of expectation. What is your bar of expectation? Well, we don't know, but you didn't meet it, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to give you some points, right? That it's going to be difficult for you to argue against. So we're going to continue to let the big three go and do what they're doing, and we'll hit them from time to time to make sure that they know that we're watching every now and again. But we're going to go ahead and completely obliterate.
Yeah, and it's getting so much worse. And now with AI, like I said, 1 out of 3 Americans, forget the rest of the world, just 1 out of 3. So where are we going here?
So which one of us is it on this call?
Tends to be 65-year-old plus. And every call I get is it Johnny? So immediately, I'm on defensive.
Well, I know every year that is passing on my biological clock, I get more and more robocalls. So I'm hitting the sweet spot now. Once
they stop calling me because I keep picking up and talking to them. They're like,
once AARP sends me the AARP sends me the card that says I can start getting discounts, my robocalling just went up immensely. So
and my wife signed up to it as well. I was like, what are you doing this for? Oh, dear.
But I think Alan, look, I think we're going a long time here. I think having Jason and reconnecting with him after all these years, for anybody out in the industry that really wants to talk to one of the smartest guys out there, is Jason Welch. I mean, I keep going back to STI, Sam, Kenny, the Tawfik brothers, just the legends that they are. I think this podcast needs to be started from the minute he started speaking, Alan.
Yep.
and then you could kind of put that back there. But I think
Yeah.
this is a great prelude, and I think we're going to have him back. I mean, obviously, going to try to get David Kasem on here.
Yeah.
I hope he's okay. I don't know where he is, but boy,
Well,
is he fighting.
his now response is there. So the data is presented in terms of the volume of calls that went not just to the FCC members, but to the FCC's families.
But Jason hit it right on the nose. He was targeted. This
Yes.
is a setup.
Oh, yeah,
Where
yeah, yeah.
where is the where
He was
are the,
targeted, but
why are we not going after?
if I was in the FCC, I'd be pissed. They are spamming my children. They are spamming my family. And unfortunately, they are victims, judge, and jury.
I appreciate it. Thanks, guys.